Hello, everyone. We hope you all had a wonderful summer. I cannot believe summer is almost over, but I hope that we are ready for more family history research. This is the Essex County branch of Ontario Ancestors. It's our webinar for September 2024. My name is Linda Urquhart, and I'll be your host for tonight. Cindy Robichaud, Pat Clancy, and Tammy Richard will be monitoring the questions. So thanks to them both for doing that. Okay. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which the County of Essex is located is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, which include the Huron or Wendat or Wyandot bands. As family historians, we look for the stories of the men and women who came before us, and in doing that, we must acknowledge the mistakes of the past and consider how we can best support our local Indigenous communities. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be added to the Essex County Branch YouTube channel. Also, at this meeting, everyone is muted and your camera is turned off during the presentation. Questions will be answered following the presentation. Just post your questions in the chat box as we go along. And you can see on the screen there that the chat box can be found by hovering your mouse at the bottom of your screen. We encourage everyone to visit our website, which is essex.ogs.on.ca. For the many resources available there, including a members library that houses many of the documents in both the Essex County Branch Library as well as the Franco-Ontarian Research Center Library. For those in the local area who want to research in person, the Essex County Branch Library collection can be found in the Windsor Public Library Local Histories Branch on Sandwich Street in Windsor, where it is housed. Just check their website for their hours of operation and feel free to call them for additional assistance with your research. If you have French ancestry, please visit the Essex County Branch Franco-Ontarian Research Center, also here in Windsor, on any Tuesday or on the second Saturday of each month during the whole year. We are open for visitors from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. The directions to the center can be found on the Essex Branch website under the Franco-Ontarian Research Center tab. We are pleased to be able to introduce you to the very interesting webinars coming soon. On Tuesday, October the 1st at 3 p.m., the Family Tree Maker Group will be meeting. You can register for this event on the Essex County Branch website. On Thursday, October 3rd at 7 p.m., Ontario Ancestors is presenting Practical Tools for Family History Writers by Laura Hedgecock. You can register for this webinar on the Ontario Ancestors website under Education. The Essex County and Kent branch of Ontario Ancestors are co-hosting a webinar on Tuesday, October the 8th at 7 p.m. Dana Palmer will be presenting photo preservation and storage. You'll be able to register for this webinar on the Essex or Kent websites or on the Facebook groups. Tonight's webinar is being presented by Barbara Riem Sandre, The Detroit Shoemaker, My Journey to Writing. Barbara will be introducing her new book in the Riem trilogy. Her first book was about René Riem, the first Riem to leave France and settle in Lower Canada, New France. Her second book was about Robert Riem, René's son, who ventured into the fur trading business in both Upper and Lower Canada. And her new book is about Robert's son, Hyacinth, who, along with his brother Pierre, settled in the Detroit River region. And a little bit about Barbara. Barbara is a retired teacher from the Greater Essex County District School Board. I've already described her first three books in a Riem series of historical novels, and I'm glad to hear that she is currently working on the fourth in the series. She has been doing genealogical research for over 30 years and is a member of the Ontario Genealogical Society and the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. Barbara has been a guest speaker at the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada, the Kingsville Gosfield Heritage Society, the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan, and at the Harrow um, Early Immigrants Research Society in Harrow. She has spoken at several schools in both elementary and secondary panels, promoting reading, writing, and local history. Barbara, we are glad to have you here tonight, and I will turn it over to you now for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Um, Thank you for joining me today, and welcome to my very first Zoom meeting ever. I've done many presentations in the past, but none on Zoom, so please, let's all cross our fingers. I am going to speak about the Detroit shoemaker, but I also need to speak a bit about my inspiration for writing the Myriam Ancestors series, and to touch on the first two books in the series as well. At university, I majored in mathematics and minored in home economics. I taught high school mathematics for 32 years. So you may wonder how I came to write 3 historical fiction novels. Before I began my research, I knew nothing about my ancestors beyond my grandparents. I knew I was of French descent, but was not really sure what that meant. Did we come from France? Probably, but when and why? And more embarrassing than my lack of knowledge about my ancestors was my lack of knowledge about Canadian history. I remembered very little from grade 7 social studies. I remembered names like Magellan and Cook and Cartier, and something really big that went down on the plains of Abraham, but I couldn't remember what it was. In high school, I took the obligatory grade 9 history course. And what did I remember about that? Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, and the Magna Carta. That's it. What did I learn about the Canadian government? Not a thing. The French and Indian War? Nothing. Pontiac's War in Detroit? Nope. I don't even remember learning anything about the War of 1812, if I ever did. I didn't study any history beyond grade 9 because I really didn't see much point in it. Yeah. Slide 2. Yes, okay. And it wasn't required. Shameful? Absolutely. And I'm not blaming my history teacher. He was excellent. But teachers had to teach what the curriculum dictated. Why wasn't there a course about our incredible local history? I certainly would have been interested in that. And a course about Canadian government should have been mandatory. Perhaps it is now, but it certainly wasn't when I was in high school 50-ish years ago. Oh well, enough politics, and on to my journey to writing. In 1992, an article in the Windsor Star called My Centennial Ancestor caught my attention. It was designed to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Windsor being incorporated as a city, and invited anyone who could prove that their family lived in the Essex County area for over 100 years to apply for the kit. I was always mildly interested in learning about my ancestors, so I sent for the kit, and I was off to the races. I joined the Essex County Genealogical Society, and with their assistance, I was able to trace my family tree back not only 100 years in Essex County, but to the early 1600s in France. I also joined the French Canadian History Society of Michigan, which proved to be very useful as well, because this entire area was first settled on the Detroit side of the river, with the building of Fort Pontchartrain in 1701. They called the settlement Detroit, meaning the Strait. At that time, there was no United States of America and there was no Dominion of Canada. There was only a small settlement inside the fort and then eventually outside the fort on both sides of the Detroit River. Both sides of the river made up the settlement called Detroit. Somehow, I was even able to incorporate genealogy into my math classes. I asked my grade 9 students to close their eyes and imagine they were sitting alone in a room, and then to imagine that their fourth great-grandparents walked in. Then I asked them, how many people would be in the room? One said, just me, because they're all dead. Others said 3, some said 8. How many would there be? The answer is 64, plus yourself. So as you can see on this pedigree chart, your name would go here, and each one of us has a father, biological father, and a biological mother. And each of them have a biological mother and father. So therefore giving us 4 grandparents. And if we move along on the same pattern, you would see that we have 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-grandparents, and 64 fourth great-grandparents. Exponential growth. It blew their minds. After joining the genealogy societies and with relative ease, I was able to find my 8th great-grandfather, René Riom, who came from France in 1663 and settled in Quebec City. And from there, later generations settled in Montreal, then Detroit, then Amherstburg, and finally LaSalle. So that's how I got here. To think that before my research, I knew virtually nothing about my family beyond my grandparents. I was super excited about it and spent every available minute going through my books and charts, which were spread out all over my dining room table. I remember when my youngest daughter was at the kitchen table one day coloring, and her sister came running into the house and said, "Where's Mom?" Tina pointed to the dining room and said, she's doing her uncles again. I couldn't wait to share all the information I had with my family and friends. Well, guess what? They were not blown away by René Riom, who came to Canada in 1663. Not the reaction I was hoping for. But then I thought about it. How can I expect someone to feel compassion or love or interest in just a name and a date? For example, Paul Smith, 1578. Does that evoke any emotions in you? Of course it doesn't. Even if your last name is Smith. I knew I had to find out more about René. I set off to find out why he left France, how long it took him to cross the Atlantic, and why he chose Quebec. But most importantly, I needed to know what daily life was like in Quebec in 1663. So I researched all of it, their dress, their food, their houses, daily routines, customs, and hardships. And there were many. It was fascinating. I had no idea that Canadian history could be so interesting. From my research, I was able to find much more actual documentation on René's life, such as land records, notarial records, and court cases. And with all of this stuff, I was able to put some flesh on the bones of René. It felt like I came to know him, and I loved him. I was even able to get copies of his birth, marriage, and death records from the 1600s. So, how to get others interested, in particular my own family. I needed to present René's history as an interesting story, a love story, an adventure story, and a story which put our ancestors right smack in the middle of its hardships and daily life and wars and family life, because they were there. So I began to write for family at first, but then the more I wrote, my little story evolved into a novel. Not overnight, but over 25 years. I was teaching full time and raising two young children when I started, so that's why it took 25 years. Renee came to Quebec at the age of 20, one of only 15 master carpenters in all of New France, and he worked on many jobs for the governor, the intendant, the Jesuits, and the Ursuline nuns. Renee had a temper, and it brought him to court several times. In one instance, he was even whipped with rods in the town square. And like all men between the ages of 16 and 60, Rene was part of the militia. He fought in many campaigns with the French army against the Iroquois. One of these campaigns led to the Lachine massacre just outside of Montreal, in which the Iroquois butchered more than 200 persons and carried off 120 settlers as prisoners or to be tortured later. 2 years after Rene arrived in Quebec, he married Marie Chevreau, one of the king's daughters, or les filles de roi. She was a 13-year-old orphan. Rene was 22. The king's daughters were not actual daughters of the king. In 1665, the population of New France was only about 3,000. The population of New England to the south was about 100,000. So a ratio of 3 Frenchmen to every 100 Englishmen. The French and English were both vying for the fur trade, and the King of France knew he had to do something fast to increase the population of New France, or the English would move in and take over. So King Louis XIV gathered up poor peasant girls, orphan girls, and young widows of childbearing age who were unable to support themselves in France. He enticed them to go to New France, to marry, and have many children. He paid their passage, gave them a dowry of 50 pounds, and gave them suitable clothing, sewing supplies, an ox, 2 pigs, 2 chickens, and 2 barrels of salt meat. What more could a young girl ask for? Renee is a beautiful love story, but more importantly, it educates the reader about the early history of our country, complete with wars, major events, and hardships. It also gives credit to those who paved the way for us. I'm going to read a short passage from Renee. It tells the story of Marie, the 13-year-old orphan who crossed the ocean as one of the king's daughters. Marie huddled quietly in her tiny hammock as the creaking ship rolled and pitched under the firm grip of the storm. The stench in the hold was putrid and thick, but there was no escaping it. More than half of the 200 passengers on board were suffering from dysentery and seasickness. Fierce Atlantic storms had accompanied the ship since its departure from the port at La Rochelle, and all but a few fearless crew members were forced to remain below. For days, the ship was tossed about as waves and winds threatened to overturn her. The hull creaked constantly, fighting against the ruthless forces of nature. The only sound heard above the winds and waves was the moaning of the passengers as they gave in to nausea, stomach pains, and diarrhea. Days turned into nights without change of activity or scenery for the passengers. Fires were not allowed below deck, so it was constantly dark and damp. One woman, driven mad by claustrophobia, pushed open the hatch and dashed for the deck. Buckets of salt water rushed into the lower level as she executed her escape. And like a feather in a breeze, she was swept overboard, unnoticed by a single crew member as they fought their own battles with the storm. Another woman, a young widow, clung tightly to her small child, even after life had left his fevered body. She wailed as his limp form was pried from her grip. Many passengers of this voyage found a watery grave in the Atlantic. With the large influx of women leaving France, these so-called bride ships were often overfilled. And when the stern's bunks were filled, some of the smaller and younger girls were forced to sleep in the in-between decks, where a rigged partition of wood or canvas was all that separated their hammocks from those of the 25 crewmen. The room was a mere 3.5 feet wide. Their hammocks swung constantly to the roll and pitch of the sea. Cages of fowl and pens of livestock also traveled in the in-between decks, adding to the myriad of foul odors. Passengers spent as little time as necessary in the sleeping quarters. However, in times of bad weather, all were forced to remain in their beds, as the constant lurching made even walking or standing impossible. Marie closed her eyes tightly against the sights and sounds around her, and her hands worked fiercely at the rosary intertwined in her fingers. She prayed to her mother, to her father, to Jesus and Mary, and to anyone else who would listen. Her dirty hammock swayed endlessly, and she wrapped her rough woolen blanket tightly around her. It was worn and tattered and too small to envelop both her shoulders and her feet, so she cuddled into a tight ball and managed as best as she could. Within a week, water leakage in the hold caused many of the dry provisions to rot and mold. Food was rationed tightly. Under a constant deluge of spray and crashing waves, the seamen on deck were forced to tie themselves to the rails and mast. Water found every crack on deck, and soon most of the hammocks and bunks were pelleted by a constant drip from above. Finally, after 20 grueling days, the storm ended as quickly as it began. Too late for some, whose bodies were solemnly slipped into the black ocean depth. Such was the voyage to New France and a chance for a better life for 13-year-old Marie Chevreau. Almost immediately after Renee was published, I started writing my next novel called And His Son Robert, about one of Renee's sons, the next in my line of real ancestors. Initially, my thought was, well, I know he won't be nearly as interesting as Renee. Wrong. Moving on to the next chapter of Canada's history, there was the settling of Montreal, the fur trade, the voyageurs and the coureurs de bois, the Lachine massacre, the massacre of the Hurons at Ste. Marie among the Hurons, and the beginning of the settlement at Detroit. And once again, Robert was right smack in the middle of all of it. And so I researched everything I could about that era. Robert was a very prominent voyageur in Montreal. He went on many missions to Green Bay, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Detroit. He fulfilled many contracts for the governor of New France, but one of his most important ones was the one between him and Cadillac, the first commandant of the brand new Fort Pontchartrain in Detroit. 2 months earlier, Cadillac convinced the King of France that it would be a good idea to build a fort on the river between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. His envoy of 100 men went to the Detroit River region, where there existed literally nothing but the river and beautiful forested areas on both sides. See? So for fear of Iroquois attacks, the only safe route from Montreal to Detroit was up the Ottawa River, down the Mattawa River, across Lake Nipissing, down the French River to Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, down Lake St. Clair River, down through Lake St. Clair, and down the Detroit River. This route took about 2 months, depending on the conditions. It also contained many shallow areas and many rapids and falls, making a great number of portages necessary. At each portage, the canoes had to be completely emptied of their many supply bundles, which weighed 180 pounds each. These then had to be carried on the backs of the canoemen for the duration of each of the portages. As soon as Cadillac settled on a location, a fort was quickly and roughly constructed. And then Cadillac and his second in command sent for their wives and some of their children. Robert was chosen by Cadillac for this very important mission. But something very significant happened between the time Cadillac set out for Detroit and when the fort was finished a couple of months later. The Great Peace Treaty of Montreal was signed between New France and the 40 First Nations of North America, including the Iroquois. So as you can see here, this is the treaty itself, and each of the 40 nations signed the treaty using their totem, as they didn't know how to sign their name. The significance of the peace treaty was that it meant Robert would be able to travel to Detroit via the shorter route. So now, because of this treaty, Robert was able to travel to Detroit by going down the St. Lawrence, following Lake Ontario, portaging through Niagara Falls, following Lake Erie, and going up the Detroit River to Detroit. It involved much fewer portages and a distance of only 650 miles instead of 1,000 miles. The original route that Cadillac followed had to be followed that way because south of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, this was all Iroquois country down here, and that's why it was unsafe for them to take this route. But it was still a treacherous voyage, especially with such precious cargo as the families of the commandant and second in command. Since it would be the first southern route mission since the peace treaty, it was quite risky. But the wives of Cadillac and de Tonty insisted on this route to show their bravery and confidence that they had in their husbands and the new settlement. So at this point, I'm going to do a reading from and his son, Robert, in which Robert is on his way home from a mission to the northern Great Lakes. When he returns to Montreal, he is surprised to meet up with someone he had met earlier. All right, so at the first sign of a thaw, Robert began to make his way home. On his way back to Montreal, he stopped at Mackinac Island to see Cadillac. Over snifters of brandy, Robert filled Cadillac in on the year he had spent with the Ottawas. They discussed Robert's adventures well into the wee hours over brandy and pipes. When Robert finished telling of his adventures, Cadillac began his. I've been doing some traveling myself, Robert. I've been to the south of here and made charts of the river between Lake Erie and Lake Huron. It is in a very strategic location. First of all, it provides the entrance to the three upper lakes and all of the lands watered by their tributaries. Secondly, it gives New France ready access to the Mississippi Valley as far south as Louisiana. You see, as long as the French continue to hold this land, the English will be completely shut out of the Northwest. But if the English take it, the French fur trade will be ruined. Robert was interested. But what would you do there? I would build a fort and move there as commandant. In truth, I cannot stand this place. The Jesuit priests fight me constantly about supplying alcohol to the natives. I told them if they can't get it from the French, they'll get it from the English, but they don't listen, and they complain about me constantly to the governor in Quebec. Robert was intrigued. Keep me posted on your idea. It's very interesting. Robert spent another week at Mackinac enjoying food and drink in the company of Cadillac. The day after he returned home, he went to see Cadillac's wife, Therese. Robert, she rushed out to meet him. It has been so long. What brings you to my door? I have been to see your husband, Robert said. Wonderful. And how is he? Teresa hugged Robert warmly. Oh, Robert, you get more handsome every time I see you. Oh, and we have company. She went on incessantly from one topic to the other, so happy to see Robert and to hear from her husband. Well, let's go inside and I will tell you everything. Robert put his arm about Therese's shoulder and they walked into the house together. Therese watched as Robert's face changed from amused to astonished. Her cousin, Elizabeth, stood across the room, her huge brown eyes glistening as she looked at Robert. Elizabeth, how wonderful to see you after so many years. The last time I saw you, we were in Acadia, weren't we? Robert asked cheerfully. I believe so, sir. She looked down demurely as he approached her and reached for her hand. Are you still living in Montreal? Yes, of course I am. Well, I only thought that you might have taken a husband. No, sir. She looked down again. Robert exhaled, not even realizing he had been holding his breath. And how have you managed to escape that? I didn't think it possible that you could become more beautiful than you were the last time I saw you. You say that every time you see me, sir. She blushed and smiled back at him. His heart melted. Come, let's go for a walk. He completely forgot about Therese standing behind him. Oh, don't worry about me, you two, she said sarcastically before breaking into a wide smile. Supper will be ready in an hour. They walked and talked and shared stories of what they had each been doing for the past 5 years. Robert had much more to tell, and Elizabeth listened with interest to his stories of travel to the North Country. They laughed often, as Robert had a wonderful way of telling a story. Once again, Elizabeth, how is it that you've not married? I cannot, she said. Why not? Robert looked very concerned. Because I'm in love with someone else. Robert's heart sank. Who? He asked. Why, you, of course. He looked at her in disbelief. Me? But how? What? He shook his head slowly. Robert, don't you know, I've been in love with you since I was 10 years old and I saw you working on my father's barn. But you are so, I am, well, she lifted up on her tiptoes and stopped his stuttering with a kiss. He could not believe this was happening. To think that she had spent all these years thinking about him and he had no idea. He had thought of her once in a while over the years, but as a beautiful child and certainly not as a love interest. Yet her kiss showed him that she was not a child, but very much a woman, and he responded in kind. And then he came to his senses. Elizabeth, no, we can't do this. You are too young and beautiful to waste your time with a voyageur. I'm away 6 months of the year. You deserve better. 6 months of a year will seem like the blink of an eye compared to the number of years I've been waiting for you, Robert. And 6 months away means 6 months that we can be together. I would have to change my entire being to become worthy of you, Elizabeth, and I am too set in my ways to do that. Don't you dare change, Robert. It is you I love. I might not love you if you were different. She smiled up at him, and his heart melted once again. All right, and now on to the third book in my series, The Detroit Shoemaker, about Robert's son, Hyacinth. Well, Hyacinth cannot possibly have been as interesting as Renee and Robert, right? Wrong again. Hyacinth and his family lived through the French and Indian War, the British takeover of Fort Pontchartrain, and the Pontiac Uprising in Detroit. In 1733, Hyacinth, a shoemaker, moved his wife and 2 young children from Montreal to Detroit by canoe. From Montreal to Detroit by canoe. He was the first of my direct realm ancestors to move to Detroit. Hyacinth and his family, like many of the early settlers in Detroit, suffered many hardships and losses. The infant mortality rate was high, and there were many threats by the local people of the First Nations. Things were heating up with the British, and war was expected. Many fort occupants were given land outside of the fort to make room for an enlarged garrison within. Hyacinth was one of them. His land grant was on the south shore of the Detroit River at the present location of the CBC building in Windsor. The British, of course, were victorious in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, and eventually Fort Pontchartrain became Fort Detroit. The results of the war were devastating for New France. Yeah. So on this slide, you can see on the first, before the war, all of this blue area, all of that area was New France. England had just this little bit of red, Newfoundland, and around the Hudson Bay. After the war, the French lost it all. All they were left with were 2 small islands south of Newfoundland, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. The British had the remainder. All of the land that was owned by the French previously was now owned by the British. All right, I will do a reading from The Detroit Shoemaker. At this point in Hyacinth's life, he has buried 4 of his children and is feeling deep guilt and depression. And as we know, back then, people, especially men, did not talk about depression or even understand it. There were no antidepressants or therapies. In most cases, they resorted to the only thing that could numb the intense emotional pain they felt, and that was alcohol. One day after his visit to the cemetery, Hyacinth came home more than a little tipsy. 4-year-old Catherine ran to greet him. "Papa," she squealed. Hyacinth grabbed her hands and began to swing her around and around. "Stop," Agatha yelled. "You're drunk." "Leave me," Hyacinth shouted back. He started to stumble and had to let go of one of Catherine's hands to support himself on the top of the table. Her body twisted around when he released her hand. He let go of her other hand so as not to dislocate her shoulder. He fell backward, landing hard against the side wall. and Catherine slid across the floor, her body hitting hard against the opposite wall. She wailed in pain, and Agatha rushed to pick her up. "Get out!" she screamed at her husband. "Is she all right?" Hyacinth asked, stammering his words. "I said get out, now!" He left the house and walked northeast along the shore of the river, tripping over branches and roots. "What have I done? What have I become? God, help me. Please, God, help me." He fell onto the sand, sobbing, his stomach retching. He passed out, waking later with a throbbing headache. He reached into his pocket for his flask, but it wasn't there. He thought of Catherine, but knew she would be fine under her mother's care. "I need to get away. I need to think," he groaned. "No, I need to stop thinking. Agatha, I'm so sorry. And Pierre, my son, what kind of example am I to you, or to any of my children? I don't deserve to live. I've let everyone down, and they deserve so much more. Oh, God, take me. Please, please, God, take me now." But it was not to be. He started walking again and tripped, gashing his leg on a dead branch. He fell hard on a rock, breaking his arm and knocking himself out. Blood oozed out of his leg and was absorbed by the ground beneath him. A couple of Ottawa women found him while foraging for mushrooms across the river from their village. They dragged him into their canoe and brought him back to their village. The women spooned medicinal concoctions for pain down his throat. They dressed the gash on his leg and set his broken arm. He woke later in the day. "Where am I?" he mumbled, trying to bring his right hand to his throbbing head. "You are at the Ottawa village," one of the women replied in her native tongue. "Why didn't you take me back to the fort?" "It was too far. You would not have made it. You needed medicine." "What's wrong with my arm?" It was bound to his torso. "It is broken." "I have to go. I have to get home." He tried to get up, but the pain in his head and arm flattened him. "Give me brandy for my pain." "This is better." They gave him a small cup of bitter echinacea juice and had him wash it down with chamomile tea. "Tomorrow I go home," he insisted, then fell asleep. He ended up spending 3 days healing before he could even get out of bed. The next day, the women transported him to the shore in front of the fort. Hyacinth thanked them and walked through its gates. He entered his house, and once again, Catherine was the first to see him. "Papa!" She limped over to her father and hugged his leg tightly, as though nothing had happened. Her ankle was bandaged, but otherwise she was fine. Agatha rushed to him, examining his arm and the gash on his head. Then she stepped back and slapped him hard across the face. She had been certain he had fallen into the river and drowned, or even worse, had thrown himself in. The little ones rushed to him, but the older ones held back and looked at him angrily for what he had put their mother through. Hyacinth walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a bottle of brandy. "No, Hyacinth, I won't let you," Agatha cried. "You don't have to." He opened the back door and poured the contents onto the muddy ground below. Okay. Finally, I will tell you about the ancestor I was most anxious to write about from the very start of my research. My fourth great-grandfather, Pascal Riom, was the only Riom in my entire line for which I couldn't find a death record, and it piqued my curiosity. Then I found an article in an issue of Trails published by the Genealogy Society. It listed Pascal Riom as a corporal in the 2nd Flank Company of the 1st Essex Regiment during the War of 1812. I had no idea I had an ancestor that fought in the War of 1812. So next I visited Fort Malden Library and found a copy of Soldiers of the King. And right at the bottom here, you can, well, see, right at the bottom, you can see Pascal Riom, 1st Essex Private, Flank Company, killed at River Raisin, January 21st or 22nd, 1813, entered on pension list. I had solved the mystery, and I almost cried. He wasn't an ancient ancestor. He died less than 200 years ago, and he was only 38 years old. He had a wife and 6 children in Amherstburg, and his eldest was 12 years old. What were the circumstances? During the war, a small detachment of Canadian militiamen from Amherstburg, armed with 1 small cannon, were stationed in Monroe, Michigan, to watch for the advance of the Americans from the south. Over 600 Kentucky militiamen arrived to face 63 Canadian militiamen and 200 Potawatomi Indians. A fight pursued, and Pascal was shot. He crawled into a barn for cover. The Americans set fire to the barn, and he burned to death. How could that story not have been passed on? I found it heartbreaking. I vowed then and there that I would honor my ancestor. Let me just read you a small excerpt from Invaded on All Sides, a book about the War of 1812. As it turned out, inside the barn was the body of Pascal Riom, a Canadian militiaman who had been wounded and sought shelter there only to expire. After the battle, the British would search for this missing militiaman, finding a charred body that could only be identified by his pistols and other personal effects. So again, I vowed that I would honor my ancestor, Pascal, by writing his story. But being a math teacher, I realized that starting the story, the series with Pascal's story, would be like trying to teach trigonometry before teaching basic arithmetic. I had to start at the beginning. So I started by writing about Rene, and then about his son Robert, and then about his son Hyacinth. And now I'm writing about Hyacinth's son, Joseph. And then finally, I will write the story of Pascal. And then my series will be complete. Besides, beyond that, I'm pretty sure my forefathers did not lead very interesting lives, right? In closing, my books are not genealogies. They are stories of adventure and love and hardship. They put the characters right into the history of and describe the most important aspects of Canadian history in story form, kind of like a French-Canadian version of Roots. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barb. I just wanted to make sure that you were going to put up that slide that has all
Yes,
your
I'm so sorry.
links for yourself and for where people can buy the books.
Yep,
Is there another page there?
there, sorry. Yes, there.
Good. Ah, okay, good. I just wanted to say, well, I encourage people to ask any questions they want to in putting them in the chat, and uh, we've got 3 people looking for the questions. But while you're doing that, I just wanted to add a little footnote. Barbara is a cousin of my husband, Brian Urquhart. Renee Riem is my husband's 7 times great grandfather on his mother's side. His mother was Marie Joanne Riem. And it's been a real treasure to read these historical novels, which gave us a vivid look into the lives of my husband's ancestors. And we just want to thank you, Barbara, for giving us that treat.
Thank you.
So, do we have any questions?
Linda, this is Pat.
Yep.
I've got a few questions that have shown up in my whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the first one for Barbara, it says the field de Wa regarding them. Do you know how the girls were distributed to the settlers? Did they have to apply? Were there ballots? What was the process in terms of settlers?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, once they got to New France, they were allowed to choose their husbands, as opposed to the husbands choosing them. They could say no to any proposal that they got if they weren't interested. Yes, it was just that's the way it was done.
Yeah, I had read this is Linda. I had read somewhere too that um, the
I think you muted yourself.
Linda, yeah, Linda, you muted yourself.
you'd think I would know the difference between audio and video, but still not working. Okay. I just wanted to say that from what I had read, the Fidois would go to the nuns, and the nuns would present them with different interviews with different men that were looking for wives. And they could ask them any kind of question they wanted, do you have any farm, or, like they would find out how they were doing and whether or not they would be a good match for themselves. So uh that's, I think, how it probably was done.
That's a much better answer than the one I gave, Linda.
I like the part in your book, the Renee book, of how when Renee got there, he fell off the plank that was putting him on
Ah,
the land, and his didn't his the Fidois saw him, and that sort of sparked an interest in him right off the bat. Is
something
that
like
just
that.
out of is that just out of your head?
He was too impatient to wait to get off the ship, so he dove in and swam to shore.
Oh, okay.
And then when her ship arrived, she was kind of knocked off the plane,
Okay.
and she fell in, and he ran or swam out and rescued her.
But that would be from your own imagination, right?
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
I did find that your books have, I know you say they don't have genealogical information, but they do have a lot of what I would consider genealogical information in them, much more so than other historical fictions that I've read. I mean, I really think that maybe it's
Yeah.
because there's so much history that comes out in the books
Yeah.
about things that maybe, I didn't know about either, kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I felt that I had to tell some of the more historical parts for sure, as well as the story part of it. And so knowing that not everybody was interested in, hard history facts, I wrote those sections in italics. And so that if they wanted to skim over that, which nobody did, they told me that they liked all the historical part as well. But I did indicate the difference between true historical fact and the story.
Okay, Pat, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. That's extremely interesting. Another question that I have, you mentioned Renee in the court. Where did you find the court records?
Oh, one of the series that I have is called Our French Canadian Ancestors. It's a 25, or I think it's a 30 volume set now. I've got 25 volumes. And they tell the stories with documentation of the lives of many of the settlers. And there was one in there, a story about Rene Realm, and it was several pages long, and it gave all his court appearances. There were many. There were many getting into fights and the sort, calling a woman not a very nice name. That's why he was caned by rods in the town square, and that is true.
Really interesting, isn't it? Okay, that's my questions for now.
So Cindy and Tammy, do you have any?
Yeah, Tammy has some.
You have done so much research. Do you have a favorite research website that you use?
When I started my research many years ago, there was no internet. So all the research, genealogical research I got was from church records, what's the name of that library? The Mormon library. Linda, help me
Yeah,
out.
the Family Search,
Family Search,
familysearch.org.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, the Genealogy Society, they were unbelievable, all the resources that they have there, all the books and research. Yeah. And then when the internet came to be, I went on Ancestry, but for the most part, I used it to double check my facts. And now I use it quite a bit. But no, it was all done by church records and the libraries. I went to Quebec and went to some museums there, did some research at their genealogy societies. I went to Montreal, and I promised myself that if I ever got my first book published, that I was going to go to France, to La Rochelle, which is where Rene was from. And so we did. My husband and I went on for my 60th birthday, and it was unbelievable. We went to the old ancient town. We went to the church where Rene was baptized. We went to the church where his father was baptized, and yeah, it was wonderful. You should go with your husband, Linda.
That must have been awesome to stand where it all started. Another question from Maureen Sinclair, wondering if Barbara's family tree is accessible online. Thanks for the presentation. We share the same Ream relatives.
So if my tree is available online, I don't think it is, but if you contact me, I can share my lineage, and you can tell me what yours is, and I can determine what degree of cousins we are.
Well, I know that I had the Ream family tree from Renee down to my husband's mother when I was at the university, but that website is no longer there. So I do have the Urquhart, but I don't know if I have the Ream. I'll make sure that the Reams is put up in the family history information. Barbara, did you go to the French Center that's in the old Maryvale building?
Yes, I've been there a few times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think they probably would have been the best place for you to go for help, at least in the area, because they still do have so much information about that time period, and they have all the notarial records where
Right.
you would probably find things like those court cases that
Yeah.
were, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I
And
think, go ahead.
Also, for anybody who's watching the presentation, please feel free to follow me on Facebook and Instagram under riamseries@gmail.com.
And I see that your email address is there too, if people
Yes.
wanted to ask you a
Yes.
question.
Yes.
That'd be great. I think we would, as family historians, we would be extremely interested in the resources that you use. So at some point in time, I'm going to bug you to give us a list of links or whatever of where, how you found out this information, especially the information about how people lived, like not the necessarily the genealogical information, but the actual historical information of how things were in that time period,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. I
Mhm.
think people are always looking for that kind of thing, and I'm not sure if you may have some books or whatever that you could recommend to us to get a hold of, at the
Yeah.
library.
Well, each of my books has a bibliography at the back.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yes, so I, list all of the books that I used. I remember when I first started writing, I was still teaching at Essex High School, and I used to go to our library and just search the history section and get a lot of books there, and I've written them up in my bibliography. So, yeah, or any library, go to the history section and look for social histories.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We have a someone saying hello Barb, it's your cousin Elaine Riam. Barb sought for any Riams who could be her relatives, and yes, we have a link. I've so enjoyed her books and bought them for each of the Riam nephews and nieces.
Oh,
I love how she relates the history of our area to the family experiences.
oh, very, very nice. Very nice. Thank you very much.
And then there's something from a Kathy McGee. Wonderful presentation, inspired me to get back to writing about my interesting family. Question, is all the history you mentioned captured in your books? Like you, I learned so little of our Canadian history in school so many years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it's everything that I've read in my presentation is discussed in the books
Okay, that's all I have.
in much greater detail.
Okay, this is Pat again. I have another question from Terry for Sandra. Why are you writing these books as novels rather than nonfiction? Interesting.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I never took much history in school at all. And yet I found myself drawn to historical romance novels and movies, period pieces. And that's where I learned a great deal of my history. And when I was going to start writing, I thought, no, it's got to be in story form or nobody will be interested. Because if they just want history, they can go to the library. But if they want to learn it while following an interesting love story as well, that's what I thought. And that's why I did it that way.
Yes, and I think that that's really important because, I'm very interested in family history, but when I talk to relatives on either side of the family, sometimes their eyes just sort of glass over and it's like, oh, here she goes again, kind of thing. So I know that
Yes,
because
yes,
all I have is, the dates and,
facts.
when they got
Yeah.
married and, where they lived, but really nothing more than that. So
Oh,
putting it in a novel is really, I think, a great tribute to
Yeah.
your ancestors.
and you have to understand what everyday life was like with them. Otherwise, it had no meaning, I think.
Right, exactly. Well, I think our time is up. Are there any other questions we haven't covered?
There are a couple of here. One, someone is Patty says, do you have more support and love of your ancestors from your immediate family now?
Oh,
you've written these
absolutely.
books.
They don't roll their eyes anymore. Especially my darling
Good.
daughters. They're
Good.
so supportive. And my husband.
And another one, Linda, quick one, another question. Are the bookstores listed in Ontario? I'm watching from BC, so I guess, can you get the books?
Oh, if yes, okay. So from BC, your best bet would be to order them directly from the publisher, I think. The first two were from Borealis Press. So if you just Google Borealis Press and contact them, they'll send you the first two books. And the third one was from Friesen Press. And if you Google Friesen Bookstore, you'll be able to obtain a book there.
And they could always email you and you can direct them to if they
Yes,
can't.
email,
Don't
if
get
they're
the
local, they can pick up a book from me. Or if it's in Ontario, I can mail them out a copy. Yeah, but it would be to
You can direct them
expensive
to, yeah, you can
ship it
direct
out
them
to BC.
where to go.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it from this end, Linda.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say goodnight then. Thank you very much, Barbara. It was really, really interesting. And
And-
I've got to get started on my writing. It's just a matter of doing it. It took you 25 years, so I don't feel too bad if I'm, but I don't know if I've got 25 years left to get it all written down.
Oh, sure you do.
Anyway, thank you again, and we'll see everybody in October for our next webinar. If you're in local, come and visit us at the French Center at Maryvale.
We
on
are having an
Tuesdays.
open house this Saturday at the French Center.
Yes. Okay, great. And you can always go to the Windsor Public Library. Tom and Mary Lou, they are two genealogical librarians, and they've got a lot of information about the French history too. So feel free to go there. And till then, I'm going to turn off then the meeting and
Hang on, Linda. I
Yep.
have one question to ask, to tell you, or comment for you. I'm having trouble with Joseph Realm, and you've got a lot of information on that I'll need to ask you about. Maybe I'll see
Okay.
what the
I don't
French-
even remember where Joseph fits in. Joseph.
Hyacinth's son.
Oh, Hyacinth's son. Okay. Yeah, probably I didn't spend that much time on the Hyacinth branch because my husband's branch is from Hyacinth's brother,
Yeah.
Pierre. So I spent more time, but I did work on it. So whatever I can share with you, yes, I can
We'll
do
talk
that.
later.
I've got your email.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
All right then. Okay, so good night, everybody. We'll see you in October. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See it.